and do that.
Wonderful. While you are doing that also, we had a question in the chat about whether or not we share the PowerPoint after the presentation.
Oh, I don't think we do. We will share the recording that'll come out, but I don't think that we'll be sharing the slides. Okay. All right, so we are recording. We've got captions on. Are we good to go? Okay. Next, ABCs of behavior, getting into behavior being an observable action. So this behavior can include anything you can see, hear, count, and it is specific, right? And you'll see on the bottom there, it says all behavior serves a purpose. But I want to be I want you to be very careful about thinking about this. Purpose does not mean intentional or choiceful, right? Because behavior serves a purpose doesn't mean that this child is really trying to get on your nerves or get under your skin. Okay, I know that that can be an easy out sometimes, and it can be frustrating. I'm not downplaying that. And then there's also an emphasis on language here at Nest where we don't view the child as a behavior problem, right? So we're not going to say something like, Johnny is such a big behavior problem. We're going to say something like Johnny has trouble or is struggling in this area, right? That language really is important. We view the child never as a behavior problem. We're not looking to fix anyone. Okay, so behavior, those challenging situations with behavior, they involve multiple perspectives, right? So we have to consider, does the student have an unmet need, right? Do we have a child with some sensory needs? They have a lot of movement needs and they're not being met. And is that why you're experiencing this challenging situation right now? Is it that the practitioner has an unmet need? Do they have a goal that they want to reach and it's not going as planned, right? Is a challenging behavior or situation interfering with engagement or learning or connection? All things to consider when looking at behavior. Now we're going to get into identifying possible triggers. I'm going to hand it off to Michelle here.
Of course. So this is a helpful visual when we think about recognizing triggers. So what we know from learning from autistic self-advocates is that there are common things that can be especially challenging from an autistic perspective. What we also want to highlight with this visual is that kids can be at different levels, and even adults and even ourselves can be at different levels in recognizing what's triggering for us. And so this is where we sometimes really need, like a child needs that adult or caregiver support and even identifying and starting to be a detective a little bit about what these triggers are. And so again, some of us are in the I'm on my way stage. Some kids might need help to identify triggers and to know what to do to calm down. Some are in that middle stage. So some of the students on this call are autistic individuals. You may be working with kids who are able to say their triggers, but aren't quite there in being able to regulate. And then again, at the very top is knowing both. And again, this is a skill that is developed over the whole lifespan. And again, many adults are still working on this in some ways, right? Is like knowing those signals and knowing those triggers and even being able to plan ahead to cope with different situations. And so what we're going to do over the next several minutes is talk about different triggers, and then we're going to link them to proactive strategies at home. Really thinking about how do we set up environments, how do we set up things ahead of time related to potential underlying triggers and stressors for autistic individuals. So we're going to go over 4 domains. We're going to talk about sensory, cognitive, social, and communication. So there are many things that can trigger sensory overload for an autistic child. And we know that sensory triggers are very common in autism. Just a reminder, when we're thinking about sensory triggers, we're thinking about sights of certain things. So for example, bright lights. For some kids, there's specific sights that are really triggering certain colors. We're thinking about smells, so particular food smells. We live in New York. Some of us are in New York City proper. There's a lot of interesting smells that come up, I think, walking, down the street, for example. We're thinking about texture or feeling, right? So the texture of clothing, shoes being on all day, thinking about like, are my socks too high or too low? Taste, so certain tastes. We're also thinking about sounds, of course. So again, think about the school day also. There's so many sounds and unexpected sounds. And then we also think for autistic individuals, just a reminder to think about vestibular and proprioceptive input as well. And when we say triggers, I also want to highlight that this can be not getting enough of the input you need or getting too much input. So both of those things might be things that we need to plan for. But again, I want to turn it over to the many experts on this call because you're all experts in your own child. If people are willing to share out what are sensory triggers for your child. So go ahead and put that in the chat if you're comfortable. What are examples of sensory triggers that you've seen? Sound, definitely, right? Certain types of noises, room temperature, that's a great one to be thinking about at home. Is it too hot or too cold? Loud noises, clothing materials, absolutely. Strong smells, yep. Hunger, yep. So that internal cue. Kids talking loudly, loud music, people speaking on the microphone. Ooh, toothbrushing. Thank you so much for bringing that up. I think a lot of our daily hygiene tasks have a sensory component. I think it's really important to think about that. Too much noise, too much light, absolutely. So I'm going to move to the next slide, but I really appreciate all the parents sharing out. Yes, hair washing and brushing. Thank you, Christina. I think often we have kids who will avoid that, and sometimes we're thinking about the sensory input that comes with that. Yep, absolutely. Yep, a lot of examples. Hair cutting definitely has a sensory component. The sound of the buzzer near your ear, the sound of like the feeling of your hair being pulled on, hair getting wet can be a big one, or feelings of wetness in general. So Nest spends a lot of time thinking about how do we proactively set up the environment to be as sensory friendly as possible. And again, I think it goes back to when we're looking at an environment, the questions that Nest is asking is there something in the environment that's preventing a learner from being successful? And what is needed to support them, right? So again, we're taking the onus off of the child, right? We're really thinking about how do we set up the environment in a sensory friendly way.
Yes. So I just wanted to jump in here and show you one of the ways we support this. So we hopefully start off the year, hopefully the teachers start off the year with a Nest classroom environment scan. So we provide this to our practitioners, and we actually ask them to do like a mid-year refresh too. So around January, after that big break, that long break when things need to be reset, we ask them to come back to this too. But you could see there, it's pretty much like I don't want to say a scoring sheet, but it kind of is. It's like a checklist, and we want them to make sure that the way that they set up their classrooms, they're considering everything they can sensory wise that we know of, right? And like I think Michelle mentioned, most of our work comes from research from autistic self-advocates, right? So we know that things like lights being too bright can have a big effect. We know that shelves looking all haphazard has a big effect, that visual overstimulation. So we do ask that our Nest practitioners go through, and this is not just for classrooms, this is for the speech room, the OT room, even like the gym, wherever the students will be, we ask that they go around with this Nest classroom environment scan to get it, because we're all about being proactive, right? So this is to get ahead of everything. One of our other big proactive strategies is a break area. So we ask that every Nest classroom have some version of a Nest of a break area. So we have two examples here, one from PS32 and one from West Prep. We've seen teachers get really, really creative with this. Some of them look so fun, but this is set up in the classroom. And the break area is not just something that's just put in the classroom and expected to be used. The children, especially the young ones, may not know how to use this just yet, right? So it's a system that has to be taught as well. And the breaks are non-contingent, right? So a child can request a break, and it's not like they have to complete work and and then go to their break area. But a lot of our children they can get overwhelmed. Sensory overwhelm is a real thing, and it can happen often in the classroom, right? So this is a little bit of a reprieve for them to be able to get away for a few minutes and then rejoin when they are able.
So when we're thinking about home strategies, and I also want to name that everyone is coming from different home environments, kids might be sharing rooms. The expectation is not that the home is going to be like a perfect sensory space, but we just want to think about ways to kind of proactively think about sensory input and maybe ways to weave that into the home environment of the routine. So one thing for older kids that we think a lot about is the location of where they're doing their homework in particular. Homework is often a triggering time for a range of reasons, but thinking about potential background noise, thinking about do they need access to headphones, also thinking about building in opportunity for sensory input. So having fidgets or preferred sensory input available, maybe right when a child comes home from school, they need either that sensory downtime, or maybe they're in a room with like dim lights and quiet, or maybe they're getting that sensory input. Maybe they really need to move around or do wall push-ups to get that proprioceptive input, things like that. And I think another thing, again, for families going into new environments, thinking ahead of time, doing a little bit of what I would call coping ahead, thinking about what are things we can think about to meet sensory needs. Do we want to make sure we're always traveling with earplugs or headphones? If we're going to like a big family gathering, like, can we think about, is there a little quieter area? Is there a hallway? Is there a place my child can go if they're going to need that sensory break? So kind of mapping out ahead of time, how can my child get that sensory input? Or is there regulation opportunities that they can have with them in environments that are beyond our immediate control? And again, I really want to turn it out to all of you to support one another. And I've been doing these for 5 years, and I learn a new strategy every single time. What strategies work for your family around sensory regulation? So things that you've incorporated at home, or maybe sensory input that you found that your child really likes. So go ahead and share what's been helpful. I'm reading because some of these aren't going out to everyone. Throwing our son on the bed in pillow fights. I love that. Strong but safe hugs. I really like that language too. Like, this is strong, we're keeping it safe. An indoor trampoline to get that movement. That's awesome. 2 votes for trampoline. Giant beanbag, a massive crash pad, and a smooshy hug. I love it. Snack. Yep. Yep, and some snacks, especially like chewy snacks, can be really helpful for that sensory input. A car blankie. I love the idea of having it like in the car, like having a little sensory kit or tool kind of on hand. Low lights is great. Trampoline's very popular. Singing together, weighted blankets.
Christina, I never thought of that. You said you have a car blankie and it stays in the car, and you can have it and go hang out in the car if we need a break. So the car itself is a great break area.
Yes. Swings, cushions to sit on. That's a great idea. This is a good idea. When we went to bigger gatherings, at one point we used a beach chair with a canopy. So kind of creating your own little sensory break space that travels with you. Pop-up squeeze toy. Tiffany, I see your question. I think, thinking about, family members not appreciating sensory breaks. I think that's a broader question that I want to save until the end to think about how do we communicate about needs. But I appreciate you raising that. A little kid tent. That's a right. So I love how you're all thinking really creatively about how do we create these sensory spaces. For haircuts, this is a great tool. Previewing some of that input or thinking about it in low dose ways, right? So like letting him feel the vibration of the clippers, because it is scary if you're going to put something vibrating straight on your head. And so having that input is really helpful also. I'm going to keep going just for the sake of time, but please feel free to keep putting in sensory examples if you're already typing them. A sensory tool that's a sticker. Awesome. So we also want to talk about what we would call cognitive triggers. And what we mean by this is one thing we know that for many autistic individuals, there are underlying challenges in executive functioning. So these are the skills that we need to kind of plan, to adjust to changes, to think ahead, to like kind of think about the steps that are needed to do something. And so common triggers for autistic kids can be related to things that kind of test our executive functioning. So unpredictability can be a really big one. Mom was supposed to pick me up, but dad picked me up instead today. Or the bus was supposed to come at 6:30 and it came at 6:45, right? Those unpredictable changes in plans. So similar to the unpredictability, right? Like my plan was I was supposed to go to swimming class today or taekwondo class today and it got canceled. That's a change in plan that can feel really, really hard for autistic kids. Demand and responsibility itself is sometimes really triggering for our kids. So like that perceived demand, that feeling like this is an added thing for me, can lead to some anxiety and some dysregulation. Also too many tasks at once. So, you need to come home and you need to take your shoes off and you need to put your lunchbox in the sink and you need to wash your hands and you need to get your homework out. All of that instruction at once can really feel like an overload for our kids. And sometimes that leads to like a shutdown, like a system overheating, right? Like it's too much information coming in, and transitions as well. So, certainly transitions come up often at school, but even at home, transitioning from a preferred activity to going to bed, transitioning from playing outside to having to come inside, right? These things can be challenging for our kids. And I already see some proactive examples around routine, a visual board, which is fabulous. So Rani's going to share some of the ways that Nest incorporates kind of proactive strategies around this in the classroom.
Yes, I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. Shamara. I hope so. I love that you're using a visual board and reviewing it the night before. That priming piece is key, right? Priming for our children, letting them know what's happening. That predictability, like Michelle mentioned, is huge, right? And I can say that I could test that for myself. I need to know what's going on. I need my to-do list and I need to know my plan for the next day. So some proactive strategies here are an entry routine. We use exit routines. We use a lot of checklists for our kids that need that breakdown, that task analysis. And then I'm going to go over a little bit of the 4 A's and very clear expectations, because that's also key for our students. So an entry routine, this is just one example, and I feel horrible because I'm not giving a teacher credit for this. This is from one of our schools. It's from the upper grades, I'm assuming, because it's global history. But this is posted where a child can see it before they even enter the room, right? So they know that they need to enter the room quietly, go and sit in their assigned seat, take out their agenda for the day, their notebook, their highlighter, their pens, and then they need to look at the smart board and then follow the instructions for the do now or the activity. So yes, it can be overwhelming, that mental overload, to have so many tasks put at you at once, but this makes it a little bit more manageable because the child can visually see what is expected of them in a step-by-step process. Same thing for like an exit routine, right? Some of our students struggle with that organization piece and getting their things together to get out of the classroom. And here it's very, it's visual, it's very clear. When instructed, pack up and return borrowed materials, right? And then wait to be dismissed and push in your chair. right? Pushing you in your chair is you can't miss that. But again, these visuals are very important for our autistic learners, and NYU, our piece, like we do train our staff to put things like this in place. Checklists, there are, I don't know how many, there's countless versions of these. These are just 3 examples that I've pulled. The one on the right there, I know is from PS9 because I took that picture myself. That's from a 5th grade classroom. And you see how the interests are incorporated in there. I wanted to hone in on that a little bit. When you incorporate your child's interests into whatever support that you're putting in place, you're probably going to get a lot more buy-in. So this child here loves sports like football, basketball, whatever it was. And they broke down like a task analysis. So a task analysis is a breakdown of steps. So for instance, to brush your teeth, there are several steps in order to do that, right? A task analysis would break it down even further. So take out your toothpaste, open your toothpaste, put toothpaste on the toothbrush, wet the toothbrush, and break it down step by step by step. So this student, the teacher would write daily whatever assignment it was, and she would write just very small, manageable steps, if the child didn't like writing or math. It made it a little bit more, I keep saying the word manageable. That's what's coming to me. But it doesn't look so daunting. It doesn't look like such a big task anymore. Oh, I did one, I can check it off. You have this sense of accomplishment, right? That middle one there, the digital ones are great, right? And that one has a digital timer, which we'll get into a little bit later. And the one on the left, that's from one of our upper grades, but even still, like the state test, you can break that down a little bit more and make it less scary, right? Okay, so getting into the 4A's, whenever we're considering a support, creating a support, supporting our students, we want to think about the 4A's. So is it authentic? Are the students interacting naturally? Are your students or your children interacting naturally? Is it accurate? Is it true in all contexts, right? Because there are some nuances there. Things can work in one way, in one scenario and not in others. Is it accepting, right? We are big believers in neurodiversity affirming practices, approaches, and the awareness building. Will students learn about themselves with this support? Will they know why they're doing this? Will they be able to advocate for themselves in the future, knowing that they might have to ask for this kind of support in some form? And then on the right there, you see clear expectations. Everything that is given to the child as a support, or any kind of instruction that is given, should be done with very clear, explicit expectations, right? So we have something called a voice level chart, so the students know exactly, not exactly, but the students know what level their voice should be on at a certain point, right? Your voice at recess is going to be a level 5, as opposed to your voice at a whole group lesson will probably be a 0 or a 1 while the teacher is teaching, right? But this can be translated into any scenario. So just be very clear with your expectations when you're using visuals.
So again, thinking about how do we bring some of these strategies home? And again, many of you have actually already shared this in the chat. Some of you may not be able to see it. It was just shared with me, so I'll read it aloud. But visual schedules and previewing, right? And again, this is also an example. This was created at the Nest School where the child was really into cats. So they found images of the cats doing the playtime, the shower, going to bed. But having that visual previewing, or having it written out, or for our older, like high schoolers, I have some high schoolers who like share a Google Calendar with their family, and they can see like, here's when the big events are coming up, or here's when, I have to go to the dentist. So having that visual priming can be really helpful. I also saw that some people gave examples. I know Nancy said she talks about like what's coming first, what's coming second, what's coming third. So that priming for change. we can't predict everything, but when we do know a change is coming up, it can be really helpful to spend some time ahead of time talking about when the change is going to happen, what it's going to be, and then transition warning. Oh, and I hear it. We love the time timer, but we have gone through so many as they stop working. Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. But timers can be really helpful. Many of our kids have difficulty with timer, what we would call like time blindness, where it's like it's really hard to know when you say like, okay, like in 5 minutes I'm coming back. What if 5 minutes means to like a kindergartner or a fifth grader, or really any age can vary widely. So having something visual they can anchor. I love the idea of using Google Home for a timer to kind of give that transition ahead of time, some of that priming ahead of time, right? That a transition is coming so that it can feel less abrupt when it gets there. We also wanted to share out this great tool that I cannot take credit for. One of our instructional consultants, Molly Perez, discovered this, and I am now obsessed with it. But this is goblin.tools, magic to-do list. So how this website works is you can type in any task that you want to break down. The number of chilies is basically how much you want it broken down, and it'll break down a task into steps. I think this is really, really helpful. Yes, we can put in the link for the chat. And then you can edit and modify it. So one, I think it's a helpful starting point. If we did this in a seminar recently where we did breaking down doing the laundry. And when I went to think about it, I was like, how would I break down the laundry besides like put the clothes in the washing machine? And it really did break down. Like you sort, you check the pockets, you put it in, which can be really, really helpful. And then also then it makes it more predictable and breaks down the task for the child. I think a common thing, for example, is like cleaning your room. That can be a very overwhelming task if it's not broken down. We also all have different definitions of what a clean room is. Like what I think is clean and my husband thinks is clean is like two different working definitions. And so having it laid out ahead of time can help with that executive functioning demand and can help, again, make it really explicit to prevent that disagreement that happens when a child said like, I clean my room, and you're like, there's clothes, still on the floor in the middle of your room. So this is also a helpful way, I think, to break down those tasks. I see thank you parents also for sharing other examples. Controlled choices. Do you want to do it in 5 minutes or 10 minutes? I love that, giving choice within the framework of your family, but building that sense of autonomy. I really think that's a great idea. I was using time timers for myself for a decade before my kids were born. That's awesome. And yes, priming for play dates, putting together social stories, thinking ahead of time what to expect. That can be, that's a really nice strategy also. And I think as we talk about some of these other strategies, they might relate to play dates as well. Oh, Tiffany says us priming on the rules, or I would say like the expectations for the play date, what happens at someone else's house. Yeah, our daughter insisted she can't see the mess in her room. We believe her. Right. She's not registering. Right.
Absolutely. I can chime in on that just now, right before I have a 6-year-old and an 8-year-old at home. My 6-year-old, he was told to clean his room. I come in, there's still stuffies on the floor. And he tells me that that's where they sleep tonight. So, I mean, I guess that's clean. So it really depends.
Yeah. And creating a time challenge. That's a fun idea. Making it fun, making it playful, right? Like how long is it going to take us to do this? So another area of trigger, and again, I'm just moving just for time, but I really appreciate all the suggestions and everyone talking with one another in the chat. I think it's awesome and really what these events are designed for. So we know that social differences and differences in social understanding can be really common for autistic kids. And so things like feeling fear of rejection, social confusion, not knowing exactly what to do in a social situation or having trouble making sense of a social demand, conflict, fear of making mistakes, over analyzing. So for some of our kids, maybe an event happens and then they're really thinking about it like days later, weeks later. And then we'll also talk about social exhaustion and masking. in a little bit, but this idea that we all have a social battery, and some of it, everyone has different levels that kind of deplete and refill their social battery. And so sometimes our kids are coming home from school and their social batteries are totally depleted. And another piece, and I think this goes back to what we were talking a little bit about the play date also, is this idea of the hidden curriculum. So the idea of the hidden curriculum is that there are a lot of social expectations that are sometimes not made explicit that we expect everyone to follow. So in any setting, right, there's kind of a set of expected behaviors, actions, or skills that are unique to that setting. So for example, when someone is in the library, they're expected to maybe behave differently, but it's not necessarily as if there's a sign outside the library telling you all of the differences. And so there's many examples of this that might come up for our autistic individuals. Behavior expectations for the subway, right? Like if someone's playing music really loud on the subway, we probably wouldn't tell them to turn it down in the same way we might tell someone, our sibling in the house, or where we're sitting in the subway. Where to stand and what to do in an elevator is one of my favorite ones, just to think about in terms of a hidden curriculum. When we get in an elevator, generally our instinct is like, we all face the same way. We're standing kind of far from the person if there's two people in the elevator. But very rarely, like I don't remember anyone ever directly teaching me that, right? Knowing to speak differently with adults versus with children, speaking differently with teachers versus your parents, right? And I think another tricky one, right, is that in certain situations, the neurotypical expectation for that situation is to not be totally honest. So receiving gifts, right? We tell our kids like, oh, you need to be honest, you need to be truthful. But actually in our neurotypical hidden social curriculum, we don't want kids to say to grandma or grandpa, I hate this present, or I didn't want a sweater again, right? And there's many, many examples of this. And the reason we wanted to raise this is just when we're thinking about priming our kids, is really thinking about what information they might need. And when there is a behavior, there is a situation that feels challenging, going back to, is there something that we need to explain about this situation or knowledge we need to share?
Okay, so getting into some ways we can support this in the classroom with Nest, we want to make sure we're highlighting context, like Michelle just mentioned, and we can use voice scales and visuals. We use a lot of visuals. But the voice scale, I think I mentioned this earlier, your voice is going to be different when you're doing independent work as opposed to being in the cafeteria. Your voice is going to be different when you're doing group work as opposed to being in a whole group lesson, right? So here, one of the examples from PS 69, the teacher was able to use visuals and put them to make it pretty explicit. So in the library, you're at a level 2. When you're watching a movie, you're at level 1. And it gives a little bit more context and support for our students there. And then PSMS 206, this is a great one. And we've seen this across some of our schools, times when we share our thoughts, right? So we have some students, and I mean, they have a lot of thoughts. I do too. I want my thoughts to be heard. But there's a time and a place for them. And during a whole group lesson, the teacher probably does not want to be interrupted. She wants to get her information across, make sure that everybody has understanding. So this visual is great for when you can share your thoughts. Your thoughts are valuable. We want to hear them. It's just not at this moment, right? It could be during a turn and talk, during lunchtime, during choice time, all these different areas, just to give that student or that child a little bit more awareness of when it's okay to share your thoughts and when it's not. And again, these are just some of the visuals. Our teachers can be very, very creative. And if you check out our Nest Pinterest page, you can see, if you just go on to Nest support project on Pinterest, you can see a lot of the supports, real life examples that are put in place across our classrooms in the city, and you might get some inspiration for some things at home too.
So we also just wanted to briefly mention the concept of masking. So this is the idea that many autistic individuals, because of societal pressures, mask or inhibit their autistic traits throughout the day. So the idea is, right, it's an action specific to autistic people to protect themselves and project kind of like a neurotypical version of themselves. We do know that this is made up of, as self-advocates have described this, and as we've really come to understand this a little bit more, that it's related to, you know, physical, emotional, and social actions, and is related to stigma as well. And so some of our kids are likely masking throughout the day. Nest is working very hard to create safe spaces for students to unmask and to feel comfortable with that. But I think we also wanted to raise this as we talk about ways to support unmasking in the home environment as well.
Yeah, so one of the ways that we can support masking is through comic stripping. I'm not, some of you may be familiar with this. If you're new to Nest, it may be worth asking your team at school to kind of coach you through it if possible, during some from family nights or family trainings. But basically you're creating like a comic, almost like a mini comic book, right? And you're drawing out with the student and some questions to help guide your child's drawing. It's kind of giving you the like an outside perspective, right? And you're kind of coming together. You would ask your child, where are you? Who else is here? What are you doing? What happened? What did others do? You know, maybe something prickly happened at school, right? And your child needs some help getting through what's actually happening or how they're feeling. And this is a great way that our Nest practitioners are able to support students. They can ask, what did you say? What did others say? And really just break it down a little bit more to see the perspectives from both sides. This is kind of what it can look like. Really, they're just like scribbled drawings. This is a nicer version. And oh, well, here, yeah, we do have an example of one.
I think this is from Christina, who was on this call, created this comic strip.
I'll give you a minute to just look it over and get an idea of it. Thank you, Christina. Okay.
So how do we support kind of with these social triggers at home? So giving space to unmask. And there was a question in the Q&A about like, what does masking look like or what are examples? It's really different for different kids. But for example, like inhibiting stimming or repetitive behaviors, not talking about your preferred interest might be an example of masking, right? Like, oh, I shouldn't talk about this because other kids don't like it or things like that. So thinking about how do we give space to unmask? You know, making sure that a child is able to stim at home if they need to, get that sensory input as well. Thinking about this concept of a social battery can also be really helpful. I think, you know, it's hard, right? Because I think sometimes when our kids get home, like the first thing we want to ask them is like, how was your day? What was it like? Like we haven't seen them all day, right? And we're excited. And sometimes our kids' social battery is so low that they really need a little bit of a break before they're engaging in conversation or before, you know, they're having more of those social demands. So thinking together as a family about how to balance that can be really helpful. And again, some of these tools that Rani just went over can be helpful at home too, in terms of elevating these different context and perspective, right? So comic stripping, right? Giving a visual way to break down, what were you thinking in the moment? What happened? Christina's sharing, she comic stripped a positive moment. Yes, so highlighting those positives also can be really, really helpful. And also helpful with those social triggers. I think often our kids tend to focus, and all of us in some ways are wired to focus on negative more than positive. And so making sure we're highlighting those connections that we see also. And everyone feel free to share out in the chat other examples of things they've done around social triggers as well. And then last but not least, communication triggers or kind of communication breakdowns can sometimes be triggering. So thinking about communication triggers that might come up in the day-to-day lives of autistic individuals, demand for eye contact, right? Look at me when I'm talking to you. Look at the person in the eye. We know that eye contact can be painful for some of our students. Figurative language, right? Figuring out that humor that might not always be so clear, that hidden social curriculum. Interpreting body language can be really tricky. So sometimes our kids default to like mom and dad or caregiver must be mad at me, or they're mad at me because of a way that they looked, even if you're not intending that, or vice versa. Sometimes we assume things about our autistic students based on their nonverbal cues, like, you know, if they're not smiling, they must not be happy. But sometimes autistic individuals don't show it that way, or vice versa, assuming they're angry when maybe they're not. And really that need for processing time. Many autistic individuals need extra time to process language and process information. And so if there's a lot of verbal information coming in very quickly, that can feel very overwhelming.
Like Michelle mentioned, eye contact can be very, it has been known to be pretty painful for autistic individuals. So I think the statistic at this point is up to 80% of autistics find auditory processing challenging as well, right? We make it a point to, when we do trainings, to really focus on or hone in on giving processing time for your students. So I used to, when I was in the classroom, and it gets uncomfortable, it can, because we're not used to it, but I would wait, sometimes I would count to 20 in my head, 20 Mississippi, 20 Mississippi's in my head. And in the beginning, it was pretty uncomfortable because it's just like, here we are, we're sitting in silence, I'm waiting for a response. But oftentimes after that 20 seconds, a child was able to respond and answer the question or participate, whatever it was that I was doing. So it really is important to just, you may not have to start with 20, who knows, but just be mindful of that autistic learners do process differently, and they may need that time from you and that support from you. And this is one of the ways we support in the classroom. So these are nonverbal cues as skills for reflection. Let me just zoom in on my screen so I could see it a little bit better. But the child is able to, so it's nonverbal, they can just hold up during the lesson without having to say anything, just how am I doing? This is, if I hold 5 fingers, I haven't got it yet. I really need your help. Right? I need you to come back and support. But if I'm holding up 1 finger, I'm an expert. I can help my friends. I'm good to go with this lesson. Right? It's just a quick check-in for the teachers to do. And it helps the children too build that self-awareness. There's that scale there. There's another, and I hate that I did this too without the names of the teachers or the schools, but there's another one there, help routine. Same thing, pretty much. I don't understand. I still have questions. I kind of get it. I'm okay. And then I completely understand. We can move on, right? Works for both parties.
So again, what can we do at home around communication, supporting communication differences? I think really thinking about, there are different neurodivergent communication styles. And again, you all are the expert in your child, but learning what is the best way that they communicate. Do they need more processing time? Do they do better with nonverbal check-ins at times? Like, how do we slow down and kind of pace our language to meet the needs of the child? Lots of validation around communication breakdowns, and also thinking about nonverbal validation, right? Sometimes a high five, a thumbs up, can also be helpful. And then we're going to talk about using declarative language as a tool at home. So I'll actually show that on the next slide. So declarative language, the idea behind this is that much of our communication day to day tends to be imperative language. So like a question that has a right or wrong answer, that is directive or is saying like to do something. Whereas declarative language is an observation that doesn't have inherently judgment in it. And so this can be really helpful, especially for our kids who have anxious reactions to feeling like there's a lot of demands, is really shifting to some of these examples of like observational comments. So again, I'll hold this visual up, right? But I think the keys here, right, is like there's observations. So I love this. The dog looks very hungry is very different than why didn't you feed the dog, right? Using first person that kind of models that partnership with the child. So, you know, let's go do this together, or I wonder if, and using those observational words, I notice, I see, I wonder, I wish, I don't know. So really the idea is shifting your language to trying to give these observations that often our kids really respond to or are open to partnering with you, as opposed to the straight demands. This is something that a lot of the classroom teachers are learning. So I know, Ronnie, you're going to talk about what this looks like in Nest. Or I can as well. So really what it looks like in Nest, right? It's neutral language. It doesn't require response. So it's not a question. It's a statement or an observation. Which really can reduce that pressure to respond. It takes a little bit of that communication demand off. It can often feel more genuine. It's not meant to be like a manipulation tactic, right? Like this is not like a way to sneakily like reverse psychology a child into doing something. It's really just a different way of communicating about what's happening around a child without feeling like we need to default to a directive. But you'll note it's not 100%. There are times that we need to give a directive. If a child is walking towards the street, that's a time to give, you know, if there's safety concerns, we need to give a directive. But if it's something where maybe you're noticing that they might try a different strategy on something, or you're noticing, right, like that kind of getting ready in the morning routine, this can be a time to try out some of that declarative language. So that's another communication strategy to be thinking
Go
about.
back. Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, no, that's okay. Because I saw a question that I wanted to just answer now in the Q&A, which was, how do I get my child to communicate with me more at home when they have so many demands put on them during the school day? I find that my child communicates with school personnel or strangers, but it feels like it's a chore to have a conversation with me. If I don't pull teeth, then I don't get much of anything. If I do pull teeth, then it feels like more demands. I really appreciate that question because I think it's something a lot of parents go through, and we want to talk, we want to know what's happening in our kids' lives, and we want to talk to them. A couple of thoughts that I have is, one, thinking about like, are there other connections? Like, is there a way to connect around their interests? So maybe the ask is not right away to talk about their day, but is there a way to connect with them around shared interests? Also, sometimes we'll have teachers and parents work together where teachers can send home highlights of the day. So the demand is not on the child to describe specifically what they did, but where you can mention and say like, oh, I heard that you did this really cool project in science today. So you have some material to work with and start with. And also thinking about kind of maybe making some things a little more close-ended. So some of our kids really struggle with like these big questions of what did you do? Or, you know, what happened? And can we break it down into where did you go? Or maybe focusing on one part of the day to have that information, but reduce some of that demand as well.
I just wanted to piggyback on that as well. I think it's important to consider timing too, because if you think about, I'm speaking from my own experience. My son, when he just started kindergarten, it's a long day, right? It's a long day, or 6 hours in school. It's demand after demand. And he would come home, he was tired. And I knew that I could not ask him how his day was on the drive home, or even as soon as he arrived in the house. I had to wait. I had to wait till after he had his snack, he got to relax a little bit, and he was ready to talk, right? I needed to wait. And even when I did, it was more, like we just mentioned, a little bit more of that declarative language there. So it wasn't so many questions. It was, I had a really long day today. I had to get such a, and I would talk a little bit more about me and make that conversation, get that conversation going. And he was a little bit more willing to give me some info on his day. So I think timing also is key.
So we're going to switch gear and talk to co-regulation. The idea being that like we can put in a lot of wonderful proactive strategies. We spend a lot of time thinking about proactive strategies, and there are still going to be times when our child is experiencing dysregulation and needs kind of our help and our support. And so I really love this visual, right, of like co-regulation really being about how do we bring our calm into the storm that our children are experiencing. And I think one part of co-regulation and really helping ourselves is really trying to shift how we think about what's happening in these challenging moments and trying to shift away from like shaming or labeling, whether it's like internal for our child, whether it's also shaming or labeling ourselves, right? I think parents and caregivers do a lot of negative self-talk also, to really trying to think about with more empathy and compassion, like really thinking about, and I love this quote, what if they are doing the best they can in this moment, right? That like when a child is in the peak of a meltdown, or tying all the way back to what we talked about an hour ago, right? Where like all behavior has a purpose. Like we believe that kids, in the moment are trying to do the best they can. And sometimes that looks like a meltdown, or sometimes that looks like really big feelings that they're trying to navigate or manage. But I think this reframe can be helpful as the adults who are coming into the situation and trying to think about co-regulating. And so again, Christina, our Nest professional development director, talks about this idea of like, we got to get in the boat with the child, right? If they're lost at sea, we got to hop in there with them. And again, I'm going to talk about this, and I just want to acknowledge this is really hard. I have a toddler at home who needs a lot of co-regulation right now, and it has been an incredibly humbling experience for me as a provider who often lectured and talked about co-regulation as well. It is really not an easy thing to do. And so I want to make sure we're all treating ourselves with empathy and compassion when we think about this. But the idea behind co-regulation is that for anyone to develop self-regulation, they need to first learn and how to understand how those feelings come up. And so I think sometimes a question or a concern around this idea of co-regulation is like, well, doesn't the child need to learn how to deal with this on their own? Or like, how are they ever going to learn how these coping skills? And the reality is we all need co-regulation to support and build those skills, right? And so we think about like in an educational framework, we think about, having a structured and calm environment, modeling, keeping calm, and that responsiveness and connection as those core components of co-regulation. So again, it always comes first as a way to develop self-regulation. Although again, we all use co-regulation. One of my colleagues, Yalda, used to always give the example of like, she was like, sometimes I still call my parents and I just need them to hear me vent. I need that co-regulation, right? Like I'm not looking for problem solving. I think we often lean on our loved ones for this. In school, teachers will often co-regulate side by side with the students. It really focuses on validating and kind of riding that wave of the feeling, as opposed to like, we got to get rid of this feeling or work through this feeling. And teachers will often model regulation through their own self-talk. So, I'm feeling frustrated right now, so I'm going to do this. Rather than telling the child, like, you need to do this. So calm down. So one reminder about regulation strategies and co-regulation in general. And again, this is from a colleague of mine, but she always chooses the expression, we wouldn't teach a child to ride a bike for the first time in a rainstorm. So in other words, we can't expect a child to learn regulation strategies when they're already feeling dysregulated. Um, I have a lot of kids who I meet with who are like, if one more person tells me to take a deep breath, right? I'm their therapist, and they're like, don't you dare tell me to do deep breathing. Whether or not deep breathing works aside is a different conversation. But I think part of that, right, is so often kids are so upset, and that's when adults are telling them, take a deep breath, take a deep breath. So we really want to think about, and I encourage you all to think about as families, like how can we explore regulation strategies when we're all calm? Like, do we build them as part of our routine? Our Nest classes do a beautiful job of this, of incorporating breaks within the routine. So not just when a child's distressed, but really teaching them these skills and strategies and doing them together. When we're thinking about co-regulation strategies, we often can think about sensory preferences. So sensory input can be really helpful for re-regulation. So thinking about, are there certain things that they can touch? Are there certain sensations that are really helpful? Are there some movements that might be needed? Again, we're really focusing in the school setting about letting kids have the opportunity to have their regulation tools when they need it. Really trying to explore these things in the classroom, introducing calming ideas and really vocabulary around regulation. I saw someone put in the chat of like acknowledging their feelings, and I think that's spot on. And I think at home also, even just using some of that language, right? Modeling from ourselves, like when I feel frustrated, I take a sip of water, or like I'm noticing my body's feeling tense, I need to take a breath here. And in the Nest classrooms, what we really try to do is do this on a whole class level, so it's not signaling out a particular child.
So, like Michelle said, a lot of our Nest practices, we recommend that they are done whole class. I love going into my schools and saying Nest is best because our Nest practices, they're not just for Nest students, they're not just for autistic learners, they work well for everyone. I find I use them at home myself with my children. I use it with my husband sometimes. There's Instead of being singled out, like Michelle said, this whole class strategy, it builds that classroom community as well. But again, you're going to see, like after recess, everyone comes in, they're all hyped up, right? Things are crazy. You might have to tone down the lights, regather before you start your lesson. And here, these are just 3 ways that we've shown some of our staff to regulate. It's one is square breathing. This can easily be done at home too. So you breathe in slowly for 4 seconds, and you can even do like the motion with your hands too and make that little square. You hold your breath for 4 seconds, you breathe out slowly for 4, and then just stay empty for 4. And that candle one in the middle, it's just, sorry, my Zoom is going a little wacky on me. So you can hold up 3 fingers in front of your face, and then in a calm and relaxing voice, you would instruct the child to smell the flower. So then they would breathe in through their nose and then blow out the candle. So they're slowly breathing out through their mouth, right? And then you put 1 finger down, repeat until all the candles are blown out. And there's another one here. This is a fun one, the pizza breathing. Right? You take in the smell of the pizza and then you blow on it to cool it down. Right? And having that visual also could help too. If you just keep like a pizza visual around, we see teachers do that. But you see how these regulation strategies, they're just like a quick, I tell teachers all the time, some of these don't even take 60 seconds. They're just so quick. They're not interrupting your day. They're not ruining your lessons. You just stick them right in real quick, get everybody regathered, and we can move on.
So in terms of like, what does this look like, right? Like, what does co-regulation look like? And I see Tiffany, thank you for sharing your examples of co-regulation in the chat. I think that's wonderful, right? But again, we're going back to that core of like setting up our environment, having that warm and responsive relationship and modeling these skills. But co-regulation is really kind of being there with the child and modeling skills in parallel. We're not problem solving during co-regulation, right? It's really about kind of riding through that emotional wave. So it might mean lowering your voice. It might mean modeling a skill. So rather than telling the child to do it, you yourself are doing it. It might be dimming that sensory input, dimming the lights, reducing verbal input, right? So actually limiting what we're saying, modeling a preferred activity. So maybe you're just kind of taking out some sensory tools and kind of putting them in proximity to the child without kind of saying like, you need to, go get your sensory tool or you need to do this, like having it available for them. And again, the goal is if you're modeling strategies, these are things that you've practiced when you're calm or you've practiced as a family so that it feels more familiar to the child in the moment. So again, I think, going back to how hard co-regulation is, right? Like we're sitting here saying when your child is in the midst of a meltdown, like you need to feel really calm and be calm. And so really making, this is just like just putting it out there that this, to take care of yourself also. Because I think this is really, co-regulation is really hard work. It's a really powerful tool to validate, to remain calm, to model these skills, and it's not always easy. So thinking about, how you can support yourself as well. It is so hard in all caps. Yes, it is really, really challenging.
Now it is. I know some of my own triggers. If I am hungry and I am tired, and I always say after 5 p.m., mean mom comes out, right? I am hungry, I'm tired, I'm done with work, I have to make dinner, and everybody needs to talk to me at the same time, right? 5 p.m. for some reason, everyone needs to talk to mom. And I get very, very dysregulated from that. And then that's when mean mom comes out. So I've learned maybe I should have a little snack before dinner.
Right.
Save me over. Maybe I should, take a few minutes before 5 p.m., knowing what's coming, knowing that this storm is coming. Let me go outside for a walk. Let me do something real quick, even if it's just for a couple of minutes, just so that I'm not so irritated in the moment and I'm not blowing up. Or, I have 2 young kids. They're very close in age. So naturally there's a lot of fighting that goes on in my house, and then I'm not trying to break up a fight, but I'm also reaching the same level as them. So that co-regulation piece, I know many of you are in the same boat as me, right? It is so important to take care of yourself. I'm still learning this. It's hard to do in the moment. So like we say, we're always proactive. Be proactive too with yourself. Know what triggers you and get ahead of it.
Oh, so this is great. So if people could share out what are their self-regulation and co-regulation hacks. So I already see some great co-regulation hack examples around drinking water out of a straw, trying to go to a separate space, right? So it can be really dysregulating when we have a lot of adults swooping in to help. And so do we need to, why? Do we need to move into a separate environment? Do you need to sub out, right? Like maybe if you have another caregiver who's home, like is there a tag in, tag out system where you're like, I'm about to reach my limit, I need to kind of switch it out, can sometimes be helpful also. A mantra, oh, bear hug and rubbing head or back. So giving that like sensory input with co-regulation. The square breathing. Yeah, I've also seen students do hand breathing. So they trace their fingers. So up, in, and down, out. And some kids also just like that feeling of tracing their fingers can be regulating. Hiding in the bathroom, I'm all for it.
I have been there.
I've done that.
I have been there even with like a little dessert in my hand too.
Hiding in the car, yes. Music is my go-to. I love that. Tapping out. You're safe, you're loved, you're safe, you're not alone. And I sit quietly. That's beautiful, right? Like letting the child know you're there, but also kind of giving them that sensory space. I think that's great. Yeah, ask if your child is hunger. We didn't talk about biological needs, but bio needs can also be a big trigger. Having to go to the bathroom, being hungry, being thirsty, that can be helpful. Helen says going out for a quick walk is a self-regulation hack. Absolutely. Music.
I love that. Mom business hours are not on. I think I need to implement that in
Like a
my,
sign.
yes.
A dance party. Yeah, and again, what I love about all of these, right? Like even if your child's not particularly in need of a co-regulating moment, but maybe you like we can also model this to, it's like I need a dance party right now. Like I need to turn on some music. Yes, hiding in the bathroom, finding we also need that quiet sensory reduced space for sure. So just as a summary, and then we'll have time for some questions. Yeah, looking at your phone. Yep. Yep.
I think looking at your phone though, I've noticed myself doing it too, because it's kind of just like that mindless, no one needs your attention. You're not actually focusing fully on anything. You can
Right.
just and scroll through your phone.
So in terms of overall summaries, like key takeaways, just highlighting that autistic triggers can look different. And that we really want to think about for each family system, again, for yourself and also your child, understanding what are some of these triggers, especially if there's, sometimes it feels like there are challenging behaviors or big feelings that are coming and we're not sure where they're coming from, and taking a step back and really thinking about, are there some triggers here? Really thinking about how do we regulate ourselves and how do we maintain self-regulation, because that's so important to the next goal, which is how do we then promote co-regulation in these challenging moments. Cat videos, budgie videos, Augie tap dancing to the bacon pancake song. I definitely need to look that up. That's awesome. Let me check the Q&A and see. I know that there were some questions that were coming in, and thank you so much, everyone, for your patience. I know there was some back and forth about like encountering people who are dismissive of sensory issues, which is so unfortunate. I'm so sorry to hear that your child has gone through that. Christina, good luck with bath duty. So someone shared that sometimes they'll say to like really not understanding people, like my child has a headache. I also would encourage you, if you're concerned about like a specific school situation, to reach out to your school team if you're concerned about sensory needs. So a question about how to manage perfectionism and minimize stress from it. Perfectionism is tricky, and can feel, it is really challenging. I think for perfectionism, one of the things I lean into is I think about some of those proactive strategies. So like before even starting a task, kind of going over like some positive self-talk, or what can we do if we don't know the answer, or what can we do if we make a mistake. So almost having that plan before starting a task. And having some of that positive self-talk. I also think adults modeling, right? Like, when you make a mistake, and modeling when we're imperfect, which I know I make many, many mistakes every single day, and kind of naming that and talking aloud through how you coped with it, right? So that the child doesn't feel like they're the only one, are a couple of things I would think about. I know, Ronnie, if you have anything to add around perfectionism.
I actually just was consulting on this at a school actually. So the perfectionism, one of the ways I think is to like Michelle said, is to highlight the positives, right? And we had a pair of teachers that just like showered this child with all of the positive things that he did, and they made like a little book, even like almost like a little I guess like a yearbook. And all the teachers that he had, and all of his therapists, whatever it was, they wrote like little positive notes, and they highlighted all the great things that he did, so that he noticed that oh wow, it's not so scary when I have to do something new. I've done great things before. So I think really highlighting the positive moments, and then even making it tangible, right? So if you hung something up in your house, if you made like a little board or something in your child's room or in your living room, wherever you, on your fridge. Put something up to highlight the really positive moments.
And then there's suggestions for how to answer questions around social injustice. So one of the strengths, I think, for many autistic kids, or a way to frame it as a strength, is they have a really strong sense of justice, right? Like a really strong sense of right and wrong or fairness, which I think can be a tremendous strength. We have many autistic self-advocates who are incredible advocates in like the, in broader world events, and can also be challenging when it's hard to understand like nuances or that gray area. So the question was, any suggestions of how to answer questions like, my friend gets to do this, why can't I? It's not fair. So this is not a perfect answer. One, I think validating the feeling, even if we're not agreeing with it, right? Like, I think it's okay to validate and say, like, I totally get why that feels unfair, or like, it can definitely feel hard when friends have different rules. And then elevating that context, right? Different families have different rules, different families have different ways of doing things. To kind of lift that context around the fairness would be two things that I would think about. So again, validating the feeling and then explaining the context.
Exactly the exact route I would go, Michelle. So thank you.
And then, I see a question about care providers who are experienced in identifying and diagnosing autism, specifically in girls. We are not, as a NEST team, able to recommend specific providers. I'm trying to, I don't know of like specific providers that we're able to recommend, just because we haven't been able to meet with all the providers specifically. I will say a great organization, more for young adult women, but they do teen events also, is Felicity House in Manhattan, who also I think have resources around autistic females in particular. This is an organization, it's not therapeutic, it's all recreational, but it's actually a house, like a space in Manhattan that hosts events, recreational events, and is really designed around creating a safe space for autistic females to connect. So again, it's primarily for adult women, but I know like in the past they've done art nights for teenage females, and is a nice resource in the community as well.
I see one of the questions is, how do you know your child is masking? Can you give examples of masking? Masking really is when your child is not their true selves. So you see them be almost like morphing into somebody else just to fit in, which I know to some degree we all do, right? But you would notice that your child would, it's very unnatural. You see that they're very different than they would what you know them to be. And then afterwards, it would probably be very stressful for them because they were putting on this mask. And afterwards, they're either exhausted, melting down, whatever it could, you notice that they're stressed, right? That could be a tell sign of masking. But masking, I know it seems like a complicated concept, but it really isn't. It's just the child is not their true selves. They're really just trying to fit in.
And I see a question that just came up in the Q&A about talking about child's diagnosis. So one, stay tuned, because I think we will be doing a workshop on this in the future. In the meantime, I would definitely reach out. I do the trainings for the social worker guidance counselors at the schools. We talk a lot about this. So I would definitely reach out to your school's social worker and guidance counselor for some resources and strategies of how to approach the conversation. Because I don't want to shortchange you by giving a very brief answer to a longer discussion, but I do want you to know that those resources are absolutely available, and really encourage you, if you're thinking about it, to start talking with your social worker guidance counselor about having that conversation.
I see, how do I get my compulsive reader to stop reading before bed? The whole bookshelf is in his room and he's getting sleep 10:30 p.m. to 6:30 a.m. He's 11 years old. Yes. One, I love that he's reading and he loves to, right? How great is that? But I do understand. You want him to have enough sleep. You don't want him to be tired. I would suggest working with your child, right? Sit down with him and come up with a plan together. Okay, this is going to give him some control over the situation as well. Explain to him he needs his sleep. He'll become a better reader if he has more sleep. One, he'll retain more information, right? But also, you are the parent. You've got to put some boundaries in place, and that's okay. And I would sit down with your child and say, hey, you can read from this time to this time. You can put a timer in place, or you can say you can read this many books before bed, right? So which books would you like to read? Why don't you pick one tonight or two tonight, whatever it is. And that way, choice is involved. There is autonomy there, but there's also boundaries. Our kids really still need boundaries, regardless of how old they are.
Yeah, I was just thinking the same thing, some of that previewing or planning ahead, right? Like how many chapters do you want to get to? I also wonder if it sounds like reading is an amazing interest, if there are also other relaxing. I know sometimes kids read until they fall asleep because they don't really know how else to turn their brain off. So I also wonder if there's other like relaxing things or things that can be built into his evening routine so he knows kind of, or she, I'm sorry, knows what to do when he's not reading, like when the reading stops, because I imagine he might say, well, like I'm still awake. So like what are other things that he could try and do as well? Um,
Oh, Electra. Hi, Electra.
Hi, Electra. It's great to see you or hear from you.
um, what would be the best way to communicate as the emails are going to their spam of
No.
yes. I would say every interaction you have with them or the teacher has with them, just get it out as much as you can. I don't think there's much we can do if it's going to their spam because we send out that email blast from us to whoever's registered. So on your part, you could try sending out your own email as a reminder, and you can include our link in there with our flyer. That's totally fine. There's nothing against that.
Oh, I see a question. I find it hard using many of the strategies. My Nest kid also has ADHD, so he's in a constant clash within himself. And then many autistic and ADHD individuals talk about that, like that inner kind of battle. Are there resources for that within the Nest system? I mean, I think the Nest system, broadly speaking, tries to think about like how can we make these supports accessible. So maybe we need to simplify visuals, maybe they need more frequent reminders, maybe they need even more movement breaks. But I don't know that there's like a formalized resource within the Nest system, but I think the Nest teams work really hard to try to appreciate neurodivergence more broadly and think about how can we tailor some of these things.
No open questions.
And I know people are trickling off. Um, so thank you all. And we know you're pulled in many bath time, bedtime duties are coming up. The recording will be sent out after the session. Ronnie, do you know which email it'll be sent to? Is it the email they registered with?
It'll be the email that you're registered with. So wherever you get our Nest newsletters from, that's where it's going to go.
Yeah. 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 Then I see another parent sharing about perfectionism. Any sports teams for kids in elementary school, I would reach out to your specific school social worker guidance counselor because they're going to know community teams in your area. And thank you all so much. Thank you again for being here. Thank you for everyone who is sharing out all these amazing examples and resources to other parents. We really appreciate it.
I'm going to drop the link in the chat just again, our evaluation link. We really do value your feedback. This is how we use your feedback to create workshops going forward. So we actually do need your input. And drop it in the chat once again, just so you don't lose it. We really do look forward to hearing from your feedback and creating new content for you.
And we'll be back in
January?
January.
Yes. I'd have to look at it, but we will be back. All right, so stay tuned to your emails, check your spam. If their newsletters are going to spam, please get it out of there and be on the lookout. Thank you, everyone. Have a good
Thank
night.
you.